All right, so let's get into it.
Bernie. So in society, we've seen some realizations of communism, or at least some attempts at communism, and some of the best case studies we have, of course, starting with the Soviet Union. You have 1917 when the communist Russian Revolution occurred with the Bolsheviks. So they took control. It was really trying to bring the USSR, or the Soviet Union, into this national power and prestige, make them an industrial powerhouse. So they took all the best land, labor, and capital and gave it to armed forces and heavy industry, but then you gave all lower quality goods to consumers, to the people. It started to have a really unequal and not equally distributed kind of feeling to it. So severe shortages started to happen and to occur. And so eventually, even with this devotion to military, trying to become a world superpower, they really in reality were quite economically weak. And this became very apparent as that economic weakness and instability continued to grow leading up into the 1990s with the fall of the USSR and the Berlin Wall. When you look at USSR and you look at this idea of incentive, it really made the USSR struggle. USSR, China, Cuba, communist nations specifically, and those more far left non-free economic systems are going to need something to drive it, and that is authority. So an authoritarian government is a government that has complete and utter control over everything, every aspect of life. And so these realized communist societies have only existed under this authoritarian regime. You have Stalin in Russia, you have, the Chinese government, so they limit individual freedom, they're focused on what the government demands, and it's really requiring strict obedience. The incentive becomes more of an aspect of your life and your kind of perceived loyalty to the regime than your economic incentive. So you're going to have that domination. And we have not seen a communist nation that has really been in existence without that dominant leadership that controls the society. We have seen some disadvantages that, of course, led to falls, like Cuba's moving further and further into more freedoms in their society, but the USSR completely stumbled and collapsed. And the reason is because the disadvantages. You do lack economic efficiency. Incentive really drives that efficiency. Like, why am I going to meet any kind of quota if there's no incentive to do so? So that lack of drive of the working class really halted efficiency. Economic freedom, you don't have freedom of choice within the market and production. Growth is really difficult when you're not doing efficiency. It may seem that you have quality because that's something that drives this idea to equally distribute wealth, but in every realized circumstance, the political elite class, like the military and your party leaders, are all going to be still a present elite in the society, benefiting more than the masses. And so equality has never been fully and rightfully achieved within these full communist countries. And of course, there's many other kind of goals within this economic structure that really does struggle. So even though Karl Marx is still applauded today with his idea of communist and the idea of who should have the power within a society, the idea of completely taking away incentives out of society, like profit, consumerism, and freedom of choice, really isn't an advantage in that system. And Adam Smith's idea that incentive drives an economic market really has had more success within the existing economic systems of the world. Okay, so in this video, we're going to be looking at one of the last kind of types of economic systems, or just group of economic systems, and that is what is characterized as a mixed economy. So as free markets began to rise as the rise of capitalism, of course we know that Adam Smith, being the father of capitalism and one of the thinkers that really kind of spurred this movement on, but he still recognized the need for some government participation. Mostly, he said they were responsible for three things: protecting the borders and civil law, so basically maintaining order and peace, and then providing goods. With a mixed economy, we see this idea of Adam Smith's like a free market, but we see some government intervention in the market to maintain its free and to protect those participants. So this should look familiar as we've studied the circular flow model looking at free markets, and of course there is a change, and that is right here. Whereas in a completely free market, you have no government intervention and only households and firms interact. In this particular instance, you have the government intervention with taxes or also with providing like jobs and things like that. When we look at the degree of comparing mixed economies, what's really interesting when we think about the world in general, we have very few countries that actually are on complete ends of the spectrum. The far right, which is being completely free, and far left, as you can see, we have only a few that really sample align that way. Most of all the countries in the middle are mixed economies. As we see, the United States is not going to be completely free, as we do have government interventions and restrictions by the Heritage Foundation, which is an independent foundation that basically just looks at economic freedoms. There is some bias here, but it was an interesting comparison to at least kind of share some around the world what it looks like. They have a lot of different kind of categories that they looking all the way from financial freedom, and then looking at the government's kind of health and wealth in between. Tax burden is a big one, and of course looking at all of these different things, and then creating an overall score and ranking the countries around the world based on these overall scores. In the United States, we know we are a mixed economy. Our foundation is a free market. You can go to the store and basically enjoy the fact that you can buy a variety of brands. There's competition in the marketplace. There's really a few restrictions of the competition. Only we have just monopoly laws so that we can continue to have multiple brands competing for your money. And you can go and you can buy it with very little government intervention in regards to that. But we have some things that are regulated by the government. For instance, you can't go to the pharmacist and just ask for some prescription or whatever. There's restraints, there's conditions. It has to be FDA approved. So we have that government agency that has to look at it. But because of this and that freedom to compete, we really are considered more of a free enterprise system with some minimal mixed government intervention. So our government really does continue to keep order, provides vital services, and promotes the general welfare by maintaining and also protecting private property rights. So the main goal of a free economy is to have that intervention and participate, but really maintain a separate entity as a government to keep the market as free and private as possible. So specifically, when we think about the three economic questions, the who, the what, and the for whom, when we think about how are these questions answered in a mixed economy, the big thing to understand is when you're asking, what is it? Mostly, you have the producers and the consumers making these decisions, but you do have this government intervention making sure that things are regulated in between for a fair exchange. So the original and our economies that still exist in the world today that function with a very traditional, very minimalized concept, and their values are very centered in meeting the needs of just their people. So they rely on habit, custom, or ritual to answer the three economic questions. They're usually found in very small communities that stay small, close, and secluded. All of the people within the society will work to support everybody in the entire community. It's that idea, and the phrase comes from, it takes a village. Well, because everybody in the village is helping everybody else. Agriculture and hunting are important, so they rely heavily on the natural resources and utilizing them, but for specifically just for the needs of their community. And they really do focus on minimizing waste because the natural resources are so scarce and they're so important to them, they won't waste them and use everything. Whereas it sounds great, there are some setbacks and reasons why people have moved away a lot from the traditional economic values. And that is because there's very few mechanisms set in place to deal with disaster, and it is a little bit harder to recover from certain natural disasters or things that happen. But that's one of the lower ones because they just band together and really try to overcome, but it is difficult. And they don't have an access to a wide range of goods and services because they rely heavily on what their community can produce. And they really do lack modern conveniences. It's not really an idea of, let me just toss it in the microwave. And that is because of the idea of if they cannot produce it within their social structure, then it is not needed. And those things would be produced elsewhere and have to be imported into their communities. So with this idea of what are the three economic questions, what, how, and for whom really sets the priority of their value of their society, then it starts to figure out how they answer it.